Streaming.
All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Borowski, and I will be your host for today. We couldn't be more excited to be hosting events during Secret Path Week in partnership with the Gord Downie and Channy Wenjack Fund. So the Downie Wenjack Fund is part of musician Gord Downie's legacy and embodies his commitment and that of both the Downie and Wenjack families to call Canadians to action in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land. So the goal is to continue the conversation that began with Channy Wenjack's residential school story and to support the reconciliation process through awareness, education, and action. So ever since Thursday, we've been joined by classrooms across Canada to help us celebrate Indigenous scientists, artists, and leaders from across the country and work towards meaningful reconciliation. So we have a few more events today before Secret Path Week wraps up, and we're about to join Brad Baker, who's a proud member of the Squamish Nation and carries the ancestral name Tsnomot, which he shares with his late grandfather and father. Brad has been an educator for 27 years in the North Vancouver School District. For the last 8 years, his position has been as a district principal with portfolios of Indigenous education, careers, and safe and caring schools. He was recently selected as a 2017 Governor General of Canada's Leadership Council, so one of 250 leaders from across Canada that came together to help develop strategies to push Canada forward for the next 150 years. He's also joined today by a teacher. Sarah Mazzy is joining us. She's from the North Vancouver School District. And last year, her class worked with the Downie Wenjack Fund on a unit. And so she's going to share a little bit of her classroom's journey using the Secret Path. So to our classrooms joining us on camera and those on YouTube, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited for today's event with classrooms from across Canada. And then Brad and Sarah, I'm going to turn things over to you. And Brad, I apologize. I'm going to have to get you to pronounce your ancestral name probably a lot better than I just did. But I will let you take over for a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's okay. We're from sunny North Vancouver today, not raining today for a change. But like Joe was saying, my name is Brad, and I'm a principal here in North Vancouver. My ancestral name is Tsnomot. Joe was really close in the pronouncement. So but I'm happy to be part of this webcast today because I think the Downie Wenjack Fund is very key for all Canadians to talk about reconciliation. And I think the big thing for me is our school district resides on the unceded territory of the Squamish people and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And we try to learn from them first and foremost about Indigenous perspective and Indigenous ways of knowing. And so that laid the foundation for us to join the Downie Wenjack Fund and move forward with the reconciliation and do something initiatives. And probably even more importantly for us, the connection that I personally have and a lot of us have in North Vancouver with Gord Downie, the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, who was very close to many of us here in North Vancouver through the concerts that he came to in Vancouver. Then also with Channy Wenjack being a residential school student who died on the train tracks trying to go home. My dad also went to Indian residential school for 7 years here in North Vancouver at St. Paul's Indian Residential School. So Channy's story and my dad's story, my aunties and uncles all went to residential school. And so I was very close to heart that residential school young boy, and then the rock and roll artist kind of brought his story to life from the late 60s to what we're doing in schools today. And I think part of what we try to do in North Vancouver, which Sarah will talk about what she did in her class with students and with other teachers, is sharing of knowledge for all of us to move forward, because the history of the Indian residential schools is all of our history. It's our collective ownership. And so the fund opens the doors for all of us to do something about changing history. It's not only us as educators or you as students that need to learn it, but also your parents and your grandparents need to learn the true history of Canada. Because in the big picture, for us to move forward as a society, we all have to understand each other. All of us have to get along. And I think what Gord Downie and Channy Wenjack and through the fund is allowing all of us to get to know each other better and help us move forward better in a better way. So what I do in my role, I work with all 6 schools in our school district. They're part of the Legacy School Project. We have 6 more schools joining up this year, so there'll be 12 schools, and they're from kindergarten to grade 12 classes are doing the Legacy School Project. And so I'll pass over to Sarah right now to tell us what she did in her class.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Sarah Mazzy. I am a teacher in the North Vancouver School District. My experience with learning about residential schools is obviously very different than Brad's. I actually didn't learn that that was even part of our country's history until I was an adult. So when I started teaching, it was really important to me that my students had a better understanding about our country's history than I did myself. So I started teaching about residential schools as soon as I started teaching. But when I found out about becoming a legacy school and using the secret path in my classroom, it was a really wonderful way, in my opinion, to start to share the history of residential schools through Chanie Wenjack's story and using the secret path that Gord Downie made. I really found it a wonderful opportunity to reach out to our Indigenous education team and to start to build a community within our school district, as well as with the greater community who are all working towards the same goals of educating about residential schools in order to move forward. So I'm going to share a little bit about what my classroom did last year and how we turned the learning in our classroom into action. One of the really important things to me when I was teaching about this is for my students to have an understanding about what was happening before residential schools, even before contact with Europeans. So we started off learning a lot about the Ojibwe culture that Chanie Wenjack was a part of. We also learned about the education that was already happening before contact. So we learned a lot about learning from generation to generation. And I'm just going to share with you a story wheel that my student created throughout this unit. So if you can see here, as I shared about learning from generation to generation, my students actually created a story wheel as I shared what we were doing. And then they were then able to use these story wheels to share their understanding about what it was like for Indigenous children to learn from people within their community. So from their elders, from their aunties and their uncles, from their parents. And then they were able to use their story wheels to share their understanding and start to play around with that oral storytelling process. This was from a grade 6 student, but I taught grade 6, 7 last year. We also learned different things about the Ojibwe culture that Chanie would have learned about had he not attended residential school. So one of the things that we learned about was the 7 sacred teachings, really important information that was passed down from generation to generation. We also learned about the government that was the consensus government that was happening, and just a real wealth of culture that was already in existence. So it was really important for me, for my students to understand what was going on before residential schools in order to understand just how traumatic going to a school like that would be. After we learned more about the Ojibwe culture, we learned about Gord Downie. We actually had Brad come into my class and teach the kids a little bit about the Tragically Hip and about Gord Downie and his journey on finding out about residential schools and his passion to then do something. And I think this was really important for my students to understand how once you find out about something, and especially if you didn't know about it before, it's important to then carry that information forward. So learning more about Gord Downie and his journey in the secret path was really helpful for them. We also watched Finding the Secret Path so that they could see how Gord Downie created relationships with people from Ogoki Post, where Chanie Wenjack was from. He traveled up there and actually met Chanie's sisters, which was it really just helped my students engage with what was to come with the secret path.
And I think just for Sarah, part of we talk about Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip, it's important to know their story too, that what Sarah was saying. And I think there's so many resources out there for teachers to use and for students to learn about the hip, because most of your parents probably know about the Tragically Hip, but sometimes the younger students aren't sure who they were or what they meant to the country of Canada. So Sarah was able to bring in some teachings around that, so the kids can go home to their parents and we talked about the Tragically Hip today. Who are they? So they're able to. So there's that community learning environment between the student and the parents, and also back to the school, which is very important.
And also having that understanding as a non-Indigenous Canadian person to find out about this later on, and then how they were able to instigate a lot of change and proactive action towards reconciliation. After we had an understanding about the culture that was happening before residential schools and Gord Downey's interaction with The Secret Path, then we actually watched the film The Secret Path. And our work from there was about our response to that film and how it kind of made us feel, and the work that that my students did, I would like to share with you a little bit. So after watching The Secret Path, we created some pieces of artwork to show a response to the film. So one of the things that we did is we created a color, a symbol, and an image to response of the lyrics from The Secret Path. So this was to the song Haunt Them, Haunt Them. This is another student's example of the 7 matches. So giving my students an opportunity to respond to watching the film, but also have this in display throughout the school so that students that weren't in my classroom, who weren't necessarily working with the Downey Wenjack Fund, were also learning about the things that we were discussing in the classroom. We also created pieces of artwork using images from residential schools and thinking of words that may be important to this story of Chanie Wenjack. So here's an example of one of those pieces of artwork. You can see that the railway and the tracks were very important to Chanie's story. Also, based on the song The 7 Matches, we created jars. On the inside of the jars, I had my students create matches where they wrote words that they thought Chanie was maybe feeling as he was trying to make his journey back home. And then on the outside of the jar, were words that we hoped Chanie could have had with him. It was kind of like our hopes for Chanie. So you can see those examples there.
So if you look at these examples of Sarah's class, and so what she did after this, the classroom display was that she invited in guests from the community and from other schools to come and visit her classroom. And then she had the students explain to the adults that were coming for visits of what the significance was to them as grade 6 and grade 7 students. So the learning piece continued, but the teaching piece also continued for 11 and 12-year-old students to teach adults about what they learned, so other people can become aware of the secret path.
Mm-hmm. So a really important part about the work that we did was we were learning about it, but then after we understood and had a better understanding of Chanie Wenjack's experience and the experience of Indigenous peoples who attended residential school, is what were we going to do with that information? What were my students going to do to continue on their path towards reconciliation? So part of that, as Brad was saying, was about educating other people within our school. We decided that we were going to organize a walk for Wenjack. And one of the most important things about that walk for Wenjack was sharing that information. And we went out and did an education campaign. So from my 25 students in my classroom, we went out to the different classes to share about Chanie Wenjack's story. So it went from about 25 students in my classroom learning about Chanie to reaching 600 students and staff sharing Chanie's story and having that discussion continue. From that 600 students and staff, we also then encouraged them to go out and collect pledges for the Walk for Wenjack. So it also brought that conversation and that discussion home to those students' parents. Because as I mentioned, a lot of us as adults didn't necessarily learn about Indian residential schools when we were growing up. So it's so important that other people know that this happened in order for us to be able to move forward. We were also through that able to raise money in forms of pledges. And we raised about $2,500 for the Downey Wenjack Fund, which was really a significant amount of money. But again, the important thing is we had that conversation started. And then we went out and did our Walk for Wenjack. We invited people in from the community, and it was really lovely that we all came together for this common purpose and this common goal. I feel as though working with the Downey Wenjack Fund and watching The Secret Path impacted my students and myself in many ways. It empowered my students in learning about something that a lot of Canadians maybe 50 or so years ago didn't learn about. So they felt really empowered to continue to share that message of Gord Downey's call to do something. It also showed them what it was like to take the learning from a classroom, to take action and turn it into reconciliation action in the community. So getting out there, sharing the knowledge that they've learned, raising money, and getting that discussion going. And I think it gave me a lot of confidence to keep doing what I was doing, because it connected me with such an empowered community and gave me hope that the future generations, you in those classrooms today, are going to know so much more than some of us learned throughout our lifetime. And therefore you can carry that forward and continue that learning. So it's a really inspiring fun to be working with.
So a lot of the work that's before you guys have any questions for us, some of the work that Sarah did allowed the rest of the school district to kick off some community events. Like we had Mike Downey in town, that we hosted a community screening of The Secret Path that was open to anyone in our community. It also led to many of our schools and individual classrooms walking to the memorial monument for the residential school that stood in North Vancouver. And so we have a teaching tool now that we have survivors talk to students in our school district at the residential school monument. So it's continuing learning. And I think The Secret Path overall and the Downey Wenjack Fund has opened so many doors to not only the students, but to the community, but also the corporate world to provide support for us here in North Vancouver. So we see it as a huge success, and we want to continue on the journey of supporting The Secret Path and the Downey Wenjack Fund, but also supporting everyone in our school district. Any questions?
All right. Well, Brad and Sarah, that's I mean, no doubt you guys had an impact with all those amazing activities. You really took it from, awareness, which is so important, but you took the second part, the do something, and you guys did something. And I think you made an impact on your students, but you also took it to the community. And I think that's the whole point of Secret Path and the Downey Wenjack Fund is to, it's one thing to hear stories, but what do you do after that? And I think you guys are an amazing example of a district that took that next step and are great leaders for the Downey Wenjack Fund. So thanks for sharing that story with us today.
You're welcome.
All right, well, I'm going to warm you up with a couple questions before we jump to our classrooms. And the first one's for you, Brad. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the 2017 Governor General Leadership Council. So first of all, it's pretty amazing. One of 250 leaders across Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so that experience, and so like Joe was saying, in 2017, I was selected as one of 250 people from across Canada. I was one of very few educators who were part of this of the council, and the theme of the council was moving Canada forward. And so part of the group was looking at the TRC calls to action from 2015. Then how would Canada look from 150 years from now? And so part of my role was working with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, what they're doing for Indigenous people, reconciliation. And then my group that I worked with there, 13 of us, we'd come back to Ottawa and we'd make presentations to the Governor General, David Johnston at the time. And so there was 13 presentations from the provinces and territories. And ultimately the theme out of the conference was how is Canada going to move forward with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspective, but also the relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so being part of that group allowed my own story as an Indigenous educator to be told, but also represent my Indigenous community here in North Vancouver and up in Squamish, where our territory goes to. And being an educator, I was able to have some influence on people that were in financial institutions for 30 years. They had no idea what we do in the education system. And so part of the Governor General's group is it laid the foundation, I hope, for us to move forward. And ultimately it's up to how people in power take the word from us to move forward.
All right. And Sarah, I'm going to throw one your way. So throughout the last 4 days, we've had the opportunity to talk to some really, some awesome Indigenous scientists, and a lot of them working in the area of conservation, especially out on the coast of British Columbia. And a theme that's come up over and over again is taking traditional Indigenous knowledge and combining it with Western science. I'm wondering if that's something in the district that you in your classroom, or you've seen other teachers really trying to do to kind of combine those two worlds.
Yeah, and I think it's a changing kind of field where previously we wouldn't necessarily have invited that traditional ecological knowledge into the classroom as much. And I really see this trend starting to change. And so that's one way that you can try to incorporate Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledges throughout your entire year and throughout your different subject areas. So for example, one thing that I'm working on with my class right now is early humans. And so we're bringing in information to give that Indigenous perspective of, say, creation stories, or looking at the history of our land and then pulling in those oral stories and those oral histories from our local community members. So I think it's a really wonderful way to try to build relationships within the classroom, within our Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and then infiltrate that throughout all of the subject areas. So I think it's something that's kind of starting to pick up more momentum, and you're starting to see it being more included, even more included in the more up-to-date BC. We have a newer curriculum now that we're working with. And so you're seeing some of those more traditional ways of knowing and that traditional knowledge even being incorporated into our textbooks now. So I think it's something that we can do better at, but I definitely am starting to see that being incorporated into more classrooms today.
All right, very cool. So let's meet some of our classrooms. I know we have some tuning in on YouTube, so don't forget to send some questions there, but I can see someone, and Vernon, right up and close and ready with his question. Mrs. Spears' class, let me get their mic turned on. How are we doing, Vernon?
Hey.
Hey.
Great. BCS is on the unceded traditional territory of the Okanagan Silk. This question is for Sarah. How did you make the walk for Wenjack happen and get everybody to know about it and give money and spend time, and like what steps did you use to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So after we had done all of our learning around the secret path and the learning before we watched it, we sat down, we actually sat in circle with our class, and we tried to come up with ways of what we were going to do in order to take some action and to also teach other people, because we knew in our classroom, we'd done a lot of learning around the secret path, around the legacy of Indian residential schools, and around Chani Wenjack's story. So we knew a lot about him, but it was really important for my class to then spread that understanding. So we sat down in circle and we kind of came up with different ideas of things that we could do. And we really settled on the Walk for Wenjack, because for us, we thought it was an important way to give honor to Chani. One of the things about the walk was we all walked 1 kilometer, because all together with our school students and staff, it was about 600 students. And Chani was trying to walk 600 kilometers from his residential school back home to Ogoki Post. So we thought the walk really embodied the work that, or the things that was going on with Chani. So then it was a matter of, okay, well, if we're going to do a walk for Wenjack and we want all of the school to be involved, it's important for the whole school to understand a little bit more about Chani. So what we did is we pulled the most important things that we had learned and turned that into a little educational speech, if you will, for my students to then share with the rest of the school. So together as a class, we worked to find out, or to develop, what we thought the rest of the school needed to know. So then my class went around to all of the different classes over a week or so and shared a little bit about Chani's story, and opened up that discussion. So we took the conversation that was happening in our classroom and we spread it to a conversation now happening throughout our entire school. We also sent home a little piece of writing that was similar to the things that we were sharing in the classroom, so that the parents could also then read about Chani and about residential schools. And then below that, there was little lines for names and the amount of money that people wanted to donate. So they were donating to pledge their child or their neighbor or their niece or nephew to do this walk for Wenjack. So we were then collecting lots of money, but it was also really interesting because that meant that the students throughout the school had to go home and continue that conversation and continue that discussion. So it took our learning into having conversations with people throughout our community. And then we brought everyone together. We actually did it on June 21st on National Indigenous Peoples Day. And we brought our whole school community together. And once again, my class had an opportunity to educate our school community. So we led a quick assembly about the secret path. And we had community members from our local Indigenous communities who also joined us on that walk. And we created little signs so we could kind of get attention while we were walking throughout our community, so people knew why we were walking in the first place. And then as a whole school, we did the walk together, and it was a really powerful experience to all come together for this common goal that really was very, very well received throughout our school and throughout our community. So it was really neat to see my class go from learners to leaders on this area. Thank you for the question.
All right. Very cool. And it seems like there was a lot of buy-in. And I mean, just from listening, it sounds like you set it up perfectly and really helped with that awareness piece.
Sure did.
So we're going to jump to the other side of the country now, Burlington, Ontario. Some grade sixes are hanging out with Miss Ide. Let me get her microphone turned on. How are we doing, Burlington?
Hi. We have a question from Kat.
All right.
Yep, say it.
What are the 7 sacred teachings?
Oh, the 7 sacred teachings. So I'm going to pull that up. I actually had one of my students created this this beautiful display. I'm just going to play it from the current slide. And the 7 sacred teachings, oh, thank you, are actually also attached to some animals. Yep, keep going. There we go. So one of the 7 sacred teachings is respect. One is caring. One is honesty. One is wisdom. One is humility. One is truth. And one is love. So they're all really important teachings about the way that we should carry ourselves throughout our lives. And so having respect for ourselves, for others, and for nature, for example, or having the courage to maybe take a positive risk, or having the knowing that we should always be truthful in our interactions. So I really enjoyed these 7 sacred teachings because they have so much history attached to them. They've been being passed down from generations and generations for time immemorial, but they're still absolutely applicable to how we should be living our lives today. So my class really enjoyed learning about the 7 sacred teachings, but we also went around the class and tried to think of a time that we had shown or had taken action in one of those 7 sacred teachings. So a time that we were respectful, or a time that we showed our love, or a time that we demonstrated humility. So I really found it a great way for my students to learn more about this culture, but also think about the way that we carry ourselves and how we should be taking these 7 sacred teachings and applying them to our lives. So it was a really interesting lesson. I actually had, it was Heather Meyer, someone from our Indigenous Education team, came to our class that day to teach about those 7 sacred teachings. So it was really wonderful because it also allowed my students to build some relationships with people outside just myself. So it wasn't just me teaching them about some of this culture. It was people from the community who came in and shared their knowledge with us, which was a really important relationship building piece to the work that we were doing. Thanks for the question, Kat.
Very cool. Thanks for that question, and thanks for sharing those with us. I mean, you know, those 7 teachings, they're timeless. They always apply. They're such important things for students to be thinking about within the classroom. Mm-hmm. Let's see, Squamish, Mr. Hansen's group. It looks like a big group, and I bet they're pretty loud. So let's see how they're doing today. How are we doing, Squamish?
Hi.
All right, who's up with a question?
Did anybody have a question they would like to ask, or anything they would like to add?
All right. No pressure, guys. You can come back to your classroom if you guys want to think about something. All right. Let's see. I can see someone front and center again in Vernon, so I'm gonna have to turn that mic on again.
Hi. My question is, what is consist government and how did it affect the plans for kids work in your school?
Oh, the consensus government.
That's what her name is.
What was your name?
Maya.
Hi, Maya.
Maya.
It's very nice to meet you, Maya. So when we learned about the consensus government, that was another opportunity. Actually, someone else from the Indigenous Education team came to talk to us about how it was really a process of decision making in this culture. So it was a matter of having all of the different nations come together when an important decision had to be made. And everyone had an opportunity to share what their perspective, if you will, was on whatever decision they were trying to make. And it basically meant that through the discussion and through conversation and people being able to share their perspectives, they had to come to a decision that everybody agreed on. So sometimes when we're coming through decisions, I don't know about you in your classroom, but sometimes, for example, we have to figure out, okay, well, what game are we going to play in PE today? And we share different ideas. And then sometimes we leave it to a vote. And then students will vote. And then who had the most votes, that's the game we would play. But consensus government was all about coming to a conclusion that everybody agreed on. So instead of just picking the decision that most people agreed on, it was that process of dialogue and discussion so that everybody agreed with the final response. And it was just another way for my students to understand that before contact with Europeans, there was extremely rich culture. There was already forms of education. There was already forms of government. And unfortunately, when people came, that wasn't always recognized, and it definitely wasn't always respected. So I really wanted my students to understand that before contact, before residential schools, there was so many rich things already happening in this country. And I think we could have really benefited from learning more about that, to listen to what was already happening and then take some of those ideas to help us with the government that we were going to be creating in Canada later, instead of just ignoring it. So it was really important for my students to understand that. And then we actually got to practice kind of that consensus decision making in my classroom. Okay, thanks, Maya.
All right, thank you, Maya. So before we jump back to our class in Burlington, Brad, I have a question for you about residential schools. So I know that there's a history in your family, and I'm wondering if that's something that was shared with you when you were growing up, or is that something that wasn't talked about as much?
No, yeah. So it wasn't shared with me probably until 2008, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper of the time apologized in the Parliament for the abuses that happened in residential school. And so after that happened in 2008, my father kind of told me a little bit each year has gone on, and he just turned 80 years old about 2 weeks ago, and for the last 10, 11 years, every time we go for a coffee or a tea together, he tells me a little bit more what happened to him in residential school. I will never know the full story. He'll never want to share the full story. But it's the type of thing, the more he tells me, the more that I'm obligated to share with other people about what happened in our country. And so the residential school here in North Vancouver, that was in North Vancouver, it was the monument's on a very busy street, so people drive by it every day. And some people don't know what the monument's for. So part of what is just educating what that residential school thing is, really was, and how it impacted all of North Vancouver.
And that brings in kind of that final step, that reconciliation. So, there's the awareness, there's doing something, and then that meaningful action. And I think it only comes through that awareness and through the sharing of the stories, because, I know growing up in school, it was something that wasn't talked about at all, the residential schools. Mm-hmm. And Canada, has a great history, but we do have some dark times too. So we do have to bring those to light, and that's the only way we're going to have that healing. So, All right, let's swing back to Burlington and see if there's another question for us from Ms. Ide's group.
Hi, thank you. We have Ashlyn here.
Hi, Ashlyn.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the secret path?
You want to start?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was actually in Toronto on the weekend to see the Secret Path, the concert with some of the singers and the artists. But I think the Secret Path, the poems that Gord wrote, in the imagery that Jeff Lemire, the drawings that Jeff Lemire did to go along with the poems, it's just very powerful use of senses, you know, the sound and the imagery to hit home what the young Channy, how he was trying to get home and how he didn't make it home. So I think the secret path, what it showed to me as an Indigenous person is that this young boy was walking home along the train tracks to try to get home and didn't make it. And so I think that it's a path that many of his family members have walked in the last few years since the secret path started 3 or 4 years ago. And it just provides hope. Secret path provides hope for all of us to move forward. And I know Sarah's probably got a comment about the secret path too.
Yeah. So for me, it provides an access point to students to understand one Indigenous child's experience with Indian residential schools, which is kind of like an example of a lot of different children's experience who had to attend this school. So it shares this one child's story, but it allows it to provide an example for what a lot of different children went through. I know before I started working with the Downie Wenjack Fund and before I started utilizing the secret path, it's sometimes difficult for children to understand exactly what happened and maybe the emotions that children would have felt while they were attending these schools. So it's a film, but it's also a graphic novel, and it just does a really good job at capturing Channy Wenjack's story, which can then be used as a symbol for many other Indigenous children's stories who attended residential schools. So it's just a really beautiful but difficult film to watch to kind of share that story. And so when my class did it, we actually watched it over 2 days, and we made sure we did lots of discussion in response and reflection to the different emotions that maybe he was feeling. And I think it does really do a wonderful job at capturing a mood that then you can kind of perhaps connect to as you're watching.
Yeah, and just to add to that, boys and girls, so if you have time, our very first event on Thursday was with Mike Downey, and that's Gordon's brother. And he shared, well, a lot of stories, but he shared one story in particular where he was driving and he first heard Channy's story. And he literally had to pull the car over. He couldn't believe the story. And I think a lot of people might have heard that story and kind of, oh, that's terrible, but then not done anything. But he went home. He was so impacted by it. He talked to Gord, his brother, about it. And then that led to Secret Path, the founding of the Downie Wenjack Fund. So you never know what, sharing something you learn with somebody else, what kind of impact that can have. So I highly suggest you check that event out if you do have time on YouTube. So let's check back in one more time with Squamish and see if they have a question for us. No pressure.
Thank you, nuggets.
We got one.
Oh, my name. No, I don't want them to see me.
Hi, go ahead.
Oh, what is the most important message you want to teach about Indigenous culture or residential school?
Say that, the most important, say that again.
What is the most important message you want to teach about Indigenous culture or residential school?
I think for me as an Indigenous person, the most important message about Indigenous culture is that our culture is still alive and well. Even though the government tried to suppress it and get rid of us, we're still here. And so part of it is that the Indigenous culture, the message has to be part of everybody's life because we are part of Canada. And I think for the residential school part, I think all of us have to understand that even in 2019, residential schools still impact us on a daily basis as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people because it's part of our history. And so once everyone understands in the country, students and parents, that Indigenous culture is alive and well and part of our fabric of our society, and also the residential school system that was part of our country for over 100 years, we have to understand that it is part of our history and accept that it is part of our history. So that's a good question. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to our classroom for joining in with us today. Great to see some classrooms in BC and Ontario with us. So thanks for your questions. and your interest. And actually, our class in Vernon, I think I see someone front and center again. Do you have a question? Give me a wave if you have a question. Yeah? Okay. Okay. I can't leave you hanging. I'm going to turn your mic on one more time.
What are some things you do to teach traditional ecological knowledge in your school?
Sorry, what was your name?
Peyton.
Hi, Peyton. Hi, Peyton. So one of the things that I did was I took a book called Nikna and Chamai, and I actually think it's based on an Okanagan nation that you might want to check out. One of the things that I did through that book was we looked at how information was shared from generation to generation through community interactions. So we actually took that book and we divided up a big circle into a medicine wheel into the 4 different seasons. And we then took the information that was being shared to these 2 young girls, Nikna and Chamai, 2 young Indigenous girls, and we tracked that on a medicine wheel so that we could see their understanding of the different seasons and the way that affected their lives throughout the year. So that's one way that we kind of built an understanding of traditional ecological knowledge. Another way, and I haven't done it yet this year, but that I would like to incorporate it, is through inviting people from our local communities in to share some of their understanding of the way that our local environment has been throughout our history, but also the ways that it's changing. So I find one way that it can really be well utilized in the classroom is looking at some of these themes around climate change, around how our local flora and fauna, as well as our marine species and animal species, are starting to change, and being able to bring in some traditional ecological knowledge so that we understand how it's always been and how things are starting to look a little bit different within our own local community. But an important thing for that is to invite, in my opinion, is to invite people in from the community, because I'm not the expert on traditional ecological knowledge, but we have a lot of wealth of knowledge within our district and within our local communities. So inviting people in, building those relationships with our students and giving them an opportunity to then share their understanding is a really important way that I'd like to incorporate it in my classroom. It's a great question.
All right. Well, Brad and Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. I can see that well, it's incredible the way you brought Channy's story. You brought Gord's work into your classrooms. You spread that awareness, then you did something. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And yeah, I think the classrooms had some great questions, and I hope there's some thinking out there, some wheels spinning for ways that they can kind of incorporate this into their classroom for some reconciliation.
I think there's another question there, Joe.
All right, let's squeeze one more in. Our class in Vernon, they're on the ball today. Here we go.
How did Channy Winjack walk change your community?
Oh, wow, that's a wonderful question. Sorry, what was your name? Sorry? Oh, I think your microphone's off. Okay.
What's your name? What's your name?
Grayson.
Hi,
Grayson. Hi, very nice to meet you. The way, did you say how it impacted or changed my community?
What changed?
So one of the ways that it changed my community is a lot of people in my community, as Joe said, and similar to my experience as a non-Indigenous person in Canada, I didn't know about residential schools until I was an adult. And so we have lots of adults in our community that never knew that this happened, unlike your generation today who's learning about it from a young age. So one of the ways that it changed and impacted our community was through those conversations that were happening at home as children went home to talk to their parents and to ask for pledges for the walk. They then got to educate their parents about this really important topic. So one way was just through the spreading of knowledge and information. And I think another way that it changed the community was empowering my students that when they learn about something that happened and they're really worked up and upset about it, then they can take action to create change themselves. So I think one really important message from that Walk for Wenjack was taking your learning and turning it into a positive action that can then be a positive influence for your entire community. Thanks so much for the question, Grayson.
All right, awesome. Great work, boys and girls. Again, your questions were awesome, and your attention. I was watching in the classrooms. It was right on. And I'm imagining too in Burlington that you guys were right in it too, because you guys had some good questions too. So again, thanks so much, classrooms, for joining us. Thank you so much, Brad and Sarah. Your work's amazing. And if any teachers want to learn maybe a little bit more about what Sarah was up to, are you okay if I connect them with you, Sarah, afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Sharing of knowledge is important. Yes.
Absolutely. Awesome. Good. Well, again, Brad and Sarah, thank you so much. The last thing we'll do today is I'm going to turn the microphones on, let the classrooms get a little loud, say goodbye and thank you, and then we'll sign off for today's event. So again, thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Joe.
you.
All right, classroom. All right, they never have any trouble with that part. Again, everyone, thanks so much. We've got one more Secret Path event at 2 o'clock with National Geographic Explorer Arena Priest. I hope some of your classes tune in. It should be a good one as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Joe.
you.
Thanks, Joe.